Welcome to another episode of The Never-Ending Experiment. This is Kim Anderson. We're on episode 5 of season 2, and I'm going to be talking about decolonization today. I kind of put this topic off for a bit. I was thinking about how I can approach it. I was going to even just talk about colonization, but I feel like decolonizing is kind of the important part of it. There's so many different things to talk about if you want to talk about colonization and colonialism. And, I think that decolonizing is kind of the buzzword of the day, but it's also a really important process. I think a lot of people talk about it, but it's one of those issues where there's so many issues that you can caught up in any different part of it. I think the overall idea behind colonization itself is essentially about bullying and domination. It's kind of about being a jerk, really. I mean, that's what it comes down to. To take over the territory of another of your kind. Colonization itself is like any animal can do it. Even plants can do it. They can colonize. The idea of a colony is sort of, comes from ants and bees. They have a colony of one type of insect, right? And they create this huge colony. They have a very orderly system of lifestyle. They are often clones of each other, and each individual is very, very similar to the next. But we aren't really like that. Like, we are more so a tribal species. Like, that's kind of how we have evolved. So I think what colonization is really about the push to create a different kind of human species, a colonial human species that isn't as tribal anymore, and so that we are behaving more like a hive insect rather than a great ape. Now, because I study biology so much, inevitably I'm going to be seeing it through a biological lens, which is kind of why I'm looking at it like that. But to come back to the human perspective, the politics and the history, I am by far and away mostly of colonial background because I am British and French descent in Canada, and of course British and French, we were the number one colonizers, and that history is a really painful one. It's not one that I feel any pride for. I do feel mostly shame and mostly sorrow, and I do feel that I also have suffered from it. I don't feel that the benefits have outweighed the suffering. It's different kinds of benefits and different kinds of problems. The negative part of it is essentially what's wrong with all of the colonization projects, which is that they divorce human beings from the land and they push you out of your relationship and connection to the local ecosystems, to the history and the species that live there. Now, Britain itself is quite the case of colonial mindset. And I think a lot of people that are trying to decolonize are not fully seeing the bigger picture of it either. Partly, if we go to go back into human history to see when colonization really took off, it was primarily in the Middle East, which is the area basically where human beings would have left Africa to go and spread out through Eurasia. And that pathway, of course, has been going on since before we were humans. So great ape level, the fact that most of the great apes are in Africa is kind of a sign that a lot of our origins, even pre-human origins, were from Africa. So although human beings started in Africa, we can see pretty well that a lot of other social phenomenon came out of Eurasia. So the continent of Europe and Asia, which, let's face it, it's one continent. But I think the fact that colonization, along with patriarchy, along with civilization, started in the Middle East, and along with religion, those phenomenon all kind of were born out of that area between the Middle East and South Asia. So that's really the origins. But of course, Europe really took off with the idea of colonization and expanded it all over the world. I think part of that is really geographical, because they happen to be right on the ocean. And what's on the other side of the ocean? The Americas. And it wasn't that long after that Europeans started coming that Asians started also coming in large numbers on the West Coast. Now, before that, we get into all kinds of weird arguments. I think a lot of people use these arguments from the past often to actually excuse colonization, to say that, oh, since it's been happening so long, it's fine. I disagree with that completely. I think a lot of things have been happening for a long time that aren't fine and that we still need to stop, even if they've been entrenched, like patriarchy as well. The idea of civilization, I mean, civilization, as far as I can see, is just about overpopulation. It's just a small area that got overcrowded, and the overcrowding turned into a city. That's how I see it. That's my sort of simplistic, maybe biological sensibility. A lot of people, of course, see civilization as a good thing. They see colonization as a good thing, and they see patriarchy as a good thing. And I see them all as very, very negative and very destructive to human health and well-being, and also to the environment. And there's no coincidence that our health and well-being is directly connected to the environment. And also no coincidence that a lot of indigenous cultures also center the earth in their cosmology and in their ideologies. They also center relationships between people. They are very close knit in that sense. And when you get into civilization, you get to see a lot more divisions, right? Class divisions, gender divisions. It gets more and more and more divided. And that's just when you have so many people, in order to function as the civilizational system, the colony system, we start to change. And that's where that shift in mentality is, that shift into this different colonial mentality, or even evolving into a different species, or de-evolving, I should say. The earth has gotten more and more populated with human beings, and more indigenous cultures have been pushed out of power. This is the thing, is like, if we really want to decolonize, for the people that are listening that want to decolonize, I think it's pretty hard to decolonize when so many people still want colonization, and still so many people are enacting colonization. So I think number one on the list of how to decolonize, we've got to first stop the colonizing. And it's very hard to undo the damage while the damage is being done and even increased. When we talk about decolonizing, it's going to be a conflict, because there's so many people that are still promoting and increasing colonization. The patriarchal, violent mindset, which violently took over Eurasia and imposed a patriarchal dominant system that has slowly erased nature and slowly erased the status of women. So the decolonization project, the decolonization activities now are hampered in a lot of ways. So I feel that a better understanding of what colonization is could help us. But I think a lot of people are just seeing it as white people, that white people are the only colonizers, nobody else is a colonizer, that nobody can colonize except white people. I mean, that's just wrong. Virtually all of the histories that are considered to be sacred in the sacred books of the patriarchal religions are about the patriarchal takeovers. Now, the issue in the Americas with that is profound and highly covered up. Like, I mean, it's been really, really censored. You will find the information if you look, but you will also find a lot of people saying it's not true, even though it's well documented. Benjamin Franklin was very well aware of that, and his role in the creation of the United States is It leaves something to be questioned because their removal of female power is profound in the creation of the United States and then also in the creation of Canada. The French, the English, the Dutch, all of those early settlers, the conquistadors, the Spanish, they were all very, very patriarchal. They had already been colonized by Rome. Again, the Central Asian influence moving outward is very obvious to see that they brought more and more levels of patriarchy, and that's continuing to this day. So until we recognize that a lot of people immigrate for colonial reasons, a lot of people don't immigrate for colonial reasons. Some people are actually immigrating in a decolonial way. I think if I move back to my homeland, that is decolonization. If I support the First Nations of Canada, that's part of decolonization. But I think the real problem is the legal system and the political systems that are in place are an impediment to allowing those positive changes to happen. There's also the issue of racism. You know, if you say that you support First Nations more than any other group, that's giving preference to one group. If I say that I have more entitlement to go live in England than someone who has no English ancestry, that could be construed as racist. You know, but I'm not saying it because I think that the English should dominate. I'm just saying that the English should only dominate in England and not anywhere else. You know, but if you want to get into that, and I'll go a little bit into that because, you know, again, I've been wondering and trying to figure it out, as I'm sure many people have, perhaps going to different conclusions. But how I see the United Kingdom now is basically that England, it's really more English kingdom, you know, but what happened in England is they just completely fell in love with colonization as a concept. You'll hear them talk so much about Anglo-Saxons, which were Germanic people that came over. They pretty much worship everything the Romans did, you know, going on about the Roman roads and so on. These are all the invaders. If you're in a country where you worship the invader, you've basically turned your back on your indigenous ancestry and on your history. So what England has done is to just project all of their ancient ancestry and ancient culture onto Scotland, Ireland, and Wales because they retain more of the pre-colonial culture and a bit, and it's still very, very, very colonized in the religious sense. Anywhere you find Christianity, you will find colonization. The story of Jesus is a colonial story. You know, the Roman Catholic Church aligned itself with the Romans, who were the ones who condemned Jesus. They were the ones who were colonizing the Jewish area that they were living in. So the Roman Empire has had such a big impact on the eventual European colonization, even though the Roman Empire in the beginning wasn't Christian yet. So it's kind of strange how much colonization has relied on religion and how much those religions have been based out of patriarchy. So even Buddhism is also highly patriarchal and also was used as a colonial tool. You know, a lot of the Buddhist countries now were colonized by people using Buddhism as a tool. And you can argue all day about whether or not there's positive influence of those religions. The fact is that all of those places had their own spirituality, had their own spiritual traditions that weren't necessarily inferior. But what they did differently is that they positioned nature, and specifically the nature in their area, above the others. Now, if you dig into even Jewish and Muslim history, especially those two, there's heavy, heavy impact of previous cultures that were incorporated into those religions. The pagan elements of, and again, pagan, I mean, is basically just indigenous. That's what pagan means, is the indigenous spiritual traditions that usually position nature as more sacred. And so all of the aspects of Islam and Judaism were basically just repackaged and patriarchally dominated to become more male centric than they had been previously. The Roman Empire was pagan in the beginning until they became Christianized, and then Christianity became a convenient tool of colonization, in part because there was a book, and the book was this sort of tangible representation of a psychological technology that would push everybody to believe the same thing. And there's a power to that. There's a power when everybody believes the same thing. You know, it's not that different than team sports. If you're cheering the Rough Riders, your mentality is such that the Rough Riders are the best. There's this sense of what the team is, and if we all believe in the team, then maybe the team will win. And unfortunately, colonization is not that different than team sports. And it is a lot of competition. Just like when European colonization happened, it wasn't just Europeans versus Native Americans. Most of the wars that happened were a mix of different Europeans and Native people fighting for the different reasons of the time. So decolonization is sort of the act of first understanding that colonization is still going on. For people who don't believe colonization is still going on, look at the Canadian government. We are in the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is the British Empire. It is ongoing. It hasn't stopped. It has lost a lot of power, but it's the same colonization project. It hasn't stopped. The United States is also a colonization project. It was about dissociating from their origin as Europeans to end their European cultural identity and replace it with a new system that had more to do with race. So there's another issue with colonization, especially the European colonization. And it's a frustrating knot to disentangle, because although ethnicity was not primarily on the minds of those early Europeans that came to the Americas, what was on their minds most of all was religion, Christianity, like I said. Now, the racial thing increased in importance over the following centuries. That got more and more entrenched, and the racism got bigger into the 1700s, where it kind of became more of the ideology. And of course, that was when the United States became a country. So the issue of racism, the issue of religion, and the issue of patriarchy are all intermixed with colonization. And I think in order to decolonize, we kind of have to step away from over-identifying with those issues. And I think one of the biggest problems is that when you see it too much as a racial issue, that you start to label every idea in the colonial culture as racist and equate colonization and racism as the same thing. But I think it's really important to separate them because they're not exactly the same thing. I think there has been a tendency lately to label any kind of cultural criticism as racist. But racism is a separate ideology that basically is about biological essentialism, where you believe that certain people of a certain lineage are only good at some things and other people of different lineages are good at other things. And it's virtually the same ideology that they used for dog breeds in order to breed and pure breed dogs to do specific activities. They believed that they could do the same thing with human beings. Now, that ideology is racism. Like that is the racist ideology. And it's got so many problems and so many holes in it. And, again, if we look at the Afro-Eurasian continental system, I mean, the majority of that area is a mix, right? There's not just one pure race. And the purer the race, the worse off you are, because that means you're really inbred. And we know that inbreeding is a really big problem. So the idea of blue blood, is the idea of highly inbred, light-skinned Europeans who were meant to be leaders and to take over the upper level of royalty. And what it led to was the extermination of some of those lineages as well. So it's a failure. I mean, it's a colossal failure, and they're directly connected to colonization and to patriarchy because they're all about holding power within a group and not sharing it collectively. Now, a lot of the indigenous cultures in the Americas followed very different ideologies. Like I said, they put the earth first. They were not endogamous unless they were at the top of the royalty in those areas where there was a civilization. But for the most part, in those tribal areas, it was not the case. So a lot of people will say, oh, well, if they had colonization already, if they had civilization already, if they had these ideas, then why are they complaining about European colonization? Well, I don't think they are arguing that those things were fine either, and they're not fine. Part of the reason why the conquistadors won over the Aztec Empire was precisely because they had so much conflict with the people around them because they were sacrificing them all the time. So they didn't like that. That was partly why they were more friendly. It's like, because they were attacking their enemies. And certainly the bullying aspect with different indigenous cultures was present, but that doesn't make it right. So that's the thing, is you have to look at the core of what the ideological system is, and anybody can go against their traditional culture. Again, it has to do with the culture and not with the ethnicity. So the racism ideology was a convenient tool of colonization, and you could see it more clearly than anywhere else in the United States when they started the country with slavery still intact of African descended people, and with the segregation between Europeans and Native Americans. And part of the segregationist reserve system was precisely to allow for that pure breeding system to continue. It's like a suicidal impulse. It's a system that's so demented that it ruins the people in power and the powerless people at the same time. It's all about expansion. It's all about power for me. It's all about the ego. And unfortunately, the human male ego can also be expanded into the group ego and into women as well, who will defend the male ego because it's partly a part of them as well. So it's very sad. It's a really unfortunate reality that so many people are so deeply, deeply indoctrinated into colonization. So I think it's kind of a dangerous game to play now, decolonization, because we really need to focus, I believe, on the ending of colonization before you can really be sure that all other decolonization efforts will work. And I think the segregation that has happened between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada and the United States in particular, but all across the Americas and in other places, is really damaging to both sides, because it's easy to invent ideas and thoughts about people that you have no interaction with. And if you automatically see it as negative, then you can invent a lot of negative things that aren't real, or positive things that aren't real. I see a lot of people defending cultures that they don't know anything about. I've done it because I was very deeply indoctrinated with multiculturalism. And I'm not really multicultural anymore, in part because I do believe that some cultures are more important and that those cultures are the cultures of the land. They are the indigenous cultures. I do think that indigenous cultures need to come first. First Nations need to come first if we want to have a cohesive system, a cohesive society. And I think globalization is now become sort of the other side of that, as opposed to settler colonialism, which is now disintegrating because people are so highly migratory. We have very, very globalized, very international families and groups of people that are no longer from one place, that don't identify as anything, not even from the indigenous perspective, but neither from a national country perspective either. That people have become that international now that even the idea of identifying as a settler and colonial is on very shaky ground. The other part of colonization, which I didn't mention, was the economics. And if you look at, the Canadian perspective, the English and the French, the English were more focused on the economics. They were more focused on wealth, trade, greed, industry, and the French were more focused on religion. So they were all about spreading the Roman Catholic religion, and the English were more focused on trade because Europe at that time was so divided between Catholic and Protestant. A lot of the Protestant cultures stuck together, and a lot of the Catholic cultures stuck together. It really is a game, and I think that the fact that so many people have supported the imperial and colonial systems, a lot of it does come down to greed, and I think that's why the economics of it is also a really important thing to look at. A lot of people benefited from the British Empire when they went along with it. I had been questioning and trying to understand the Indian perspective with the British Empire because clearly there was a huge number of Indians who went along with the British Empire and others. And I think what happened with the British Empire is that over those 5 centuries of existence, it changed dramatically. In the beginning, you had some of the most horrific medieval tortures and murders and genocides. And slowly with time, people got so beaten down, especially with industrialization, that used all kinds of child labor and impoverishment and really horrible working conditions to the point where people just had enough. They were dying and they were getting sick and they were just like, okay, enough is enough. We need to implement some sort of social strategy that is saving people from all of these horrible things. And I think a lot of that, although it was happening in Britain, started to spread slowly outward. And, it's no coincidence that some of the most horrific things that were done to Native Americans were done after the creation of the countries, after the creation of the United States, and after the creation of Canada. The residential school system didn't start in Canada with the British Empire. It started with the creation of Canada. So it was on the shoulders of those European settlers and their descendants that were living in Canada that started that system, that increased that system. And you have to understand that in the British Empire and the British system, they have so many boarding schools and a lot of private schools. And there was terrible, terrible abuses that happened within those schools. I mean, physical assaults and bullying were constant. You want to read a little bit about Roald Dahl, who wrote extensively about some of his experiences. I mean, they brutally, brutally tortured their own children. And often they were upper classes as well. So it wasn't just that they treated Indigenous people badly. It wasn't just that they thought Indigenous people were bad and they were going to mistreat them. The whole culture of mistreatment was what they were giving to them. It was an entire mentality of industrialization, of dehumanization, of dissociation from nature that they had already been practicing in Britain for hundreds of years, that they were trying to instill in other cultures. So it isn't about settler versus Indigenous. It's about the implementation of a violent, dissociated, cruel, evil system of colonial power. And that's the decolonization that needs to happen as an individual. I mean, that's getting now into the spiritual side, back to the religion. So here's a few interesting facts that I didn't know if I wanted to go into too much, but just so people understand, in the first few hundred years, when European immigrants started to come to the Americas, they put so much effort into converting Native Americans to Christianity, and it failed. It failed. Totally failed. They didn't want it. They knew better. They knew that their culture was better. They knew that their spiritual traditions were better. And guess what happened instead that nobody talks about? Is that hundreds of Europeans converted into the indigenous way of life. They did. That's a fact. Benjamin Franklin knew that. A lot of people knew that. A lot of Christians themselves, the ones that took it seriously, could see, and they wrote this down. The indigenous people were better Christians than they were. They were better people. They followed a higher moral code than the European settlers did. So colonization took an enormous amount of work. It took going against human nature and literally destroying human nature. And I think a lot of people just need to understand that the colonial mentality hurts everyone. It hurts everyone because it places a certain amount of material wealth above the health and well-being and survival of the entire species and of other species as well. It's a very, very narrow perspective to think that only how much stuff you have and how much technology you have is more important than being happy and being creative and having a good life and having a good quality of life. Life isn't just about chasing material wealth. And the material wealth that we have from the land is so much more important. It will give us so much more in the long run if we're able to be in a symbiotic relationship with those other creatures on the land and the land itself. So the more that I've been learning about the global system, the more that I've been staring at that map of the world, I've realized no matter what subject you're looking at, if you're not putting the land first, if you're not putting this earth first, you're going to get lost. I don't believe in a God that's way up there that's more important than our earth. I don't believe that. And I think the belief in that is part of what has screwed us up so much and has led to so many of the disasters that we tend to think of as random, but they're not random. They are directly from our rejection of the truth, which was the matriarchal indigenous cultures that existed in the past, and some of them still, luckily, exist to this day. But we need to start listening to them. So I hope that decolonization increases. I hope that people become more aware. I hope that we can walk that fine line between putting indigenous cultures first without falling into the trap of racism. I hope that we can allow for open spirituality where people are able to discover spiritual ideas on their own and open up to that in their own way rather than imposing a strict religious hierarchy on people, which I think is very damaging. I don't believe that we need religion at all. I hope that people can understand also how to live in an egalitarian society between genders and to stop getting so caught up in it. The level of sexism that I've seen with some people is really startling and very sad. I think that if we want to have a good future, men and women need to work together, not just in marriages, if at all, but as colleagues, as citizens, as people, just being able to get along with each other regardless of their specific relationship. I think children is also a really big issue when it comes to colonization. A lot of people get indoctrinated into colonization as children. And if you look at a lot of the indigenous traditions, they were a lot kinder to children. The idea of beating children was just not a thing, and it should never be a thing. This is where you teach dissociation from the body, disrespect for the body, and a misunderstanding of power. I genuinely hope that we can decolonize more, but I really hope that people understand that we need to undo the colonial system that we have right now, which is this unhealthy tie to the United Kingdom. And I am very deeply connected to that. And I'll happily move back to the United Kingdom or England or Scotland. No, Scotland is too cold. I'm just kidding. It's way too cold. Maybe France. But it's real. It's real to be able to reconnect with your own roots. And so I think, too, it's not just decolonization, but re-indigenizing. And I think the core of re-indigenizing is about understanding that you have Indigenous roots. We all do. And to find that within yourself, even if it's been disconnected, even if it's damaged over centuries, remember that being Indigenous comes from being from the land. And if you put the land first, then there is going to be a way back to that. And secondly, to be more supportive of the Indigenous cultures wherever you live. And stop disrespecting Indigenous cultures. That's just flat out wherever you are. Just stop doing that. It's not okay. Our survival is at stake. I strongly believe that we will lose our species if we don't smarten up and get more respectful towards the earth and towards nature. We depend on it, and they don't depend on us. The other species will be fine without us. We will not be fine without them. So I hope that whoever is listening will take that to heart, that decolonization, ending colonization, and understanding the core of being Indigenous and reconnecting to the land is, I think, the most important thing that you could do at all levels, spiritual, cultural, and physical. So that's it for this week. I hope you have a good holiday season. It's solstice this week, and it's going to be a big transition. And I hope everybody is doing well. And join me again in a couple of weeks. This has been The Never Ending Experiment, and this is Kim Anderson. Thanks.